Hi, this is Tim Lightfellow again, Kingdom of Ontier and the Society for Creative Anachronism. As I try to adjust the camera, it's unfortunately not going to show all of me, and that might make this a little challenging, but I will do my best to explain. The purpose of the video is if you have a new archer, some of the basic instruction we tend to give when an archer first shows up on the line says, "Hi, I'm new, I want to try out this thing," so that hopefully those who are just kind of getting interested, but maybe they're shooting at home right now or trying to get started shooting at home because of the pandemic, they can't go to practices and learn. So hopefully this can offer some tips to those beginning archers. So first thing we tend to teach on an archery range is the range safety. There is probably some variation from kingdom to kingdom. The basics we try to cover is we explain the word hold, what that means in the context of pretty much any of the martial activities in the SCA, which is there is some sort of safety concern, risk, and you need to disengage from the activity for a moment while that gets resolved. In archery, if someone calls hold, what you do is you let down, if you're at a draw, you let it down, you take the arrow off the bow, you step off the shooting line, you wait for that issue to be resolved and someone to tell you you can continue. Other safety concerns is in Ontier, and again, there may be some variations, so depending on your kingdom, verify things or check things with local marshals just to be sure what your local rules are. In Ontario, you don't put an arrow on the string of your bow until you are straddling the shooting line. Otherwise, you're walking around behind people with a loaded weapon. You also, in Ontario, we do not take the bows down range with us. So when we go to retrieve, we leave the bows on a bow stand or a chair or in the back of the car or wherever is convenient, somewhere where they won't get stepped on. And then we go and retrieve our arrows. When we're retrieving arrows, if you have any that are beyond the target butt, we stick an arrow up in the top of the target butt, and that acts as a flag, because a lot of times if you have a stack of bales or on our practice range, we have a foam around a bulldog target. These are things that aren't see-through. And so if you're behind the bale bending over because your arrow's dug into the dirt, the marshal doesn't see you, so they can hopefully spot that flag up so they know someone is downrange and they don't open the range with someone bent over behind a target butt. Obviously, if you have a range where you use like the rounds on a tripod, that's less of an issue, but we still put a flag up just as a matter of course in this kingdom. I'm trying to think of other safeties. If you are working on something behind the line that requires knocking an arrow, like you're trying to check where your knock bead is at or something, generally we keep it aimed at the ground. We try to let the marshal know that we're doing that so that they don't get upset if they see us knocking an arrow behind the line. I think that covers most of the standard safety issues. The one other is you don't go retrieve your arrows until you're told you can do that by the range marshal. Our typical calls here are ranges closed down, you may retrieve, which are 3 separate calls. And I've heard the last 2 called in opposite order, but the point being, or the first 2, sorry, bows down, range closed, or range closed, bows down. But the point being, put your bow down. Once I'm sure everyone's complying with that, I'm going to tell you, you can go get your arrows. So you don't just run and get your arrows, or someone's probably going to call a hold or call you on going and to retrieve without permission. And again, that's a safety issue because it may be that the marshal sees that someone else is, getting ready to shoot or still has an arrow on their bow maybe they're starting to take it down to put away, but if you run down range while they're doing that or walk down range, there's the potential of a safety issue there. Okay, on to some of the form things we teach, and this gets a little tricky because when we're teaching a new archer, we try to work with them, kind of judge each person handle a different amount of information. So some people you can literally go A to Z, like here's all the pieces we do to be consistent and demonstrate it all when they step to the line. Other people, it's 2 or 3 structures, then they start, and then you kind of give them one more, and then they do that. So giving kind of a lot of info, you may find that you want to kind of take a piece or two and then come back and watch later and try and grab another piece or two. Believe me, that's fine. Like I said, when we're working directly with someone, we try to gauge if we're overloading them with information or not, because the goal is always to help you improve, to help you get to try out in archery, hopefully enjoy archery. I mean, we do, that's why we teach it, and help you along that path rather than scare you away because, oh my God, all the things. So just to be clear about that. So in terms of form for handbow, I can discuss crossbow in a little bit or possibly in another video. I think we'll focus on handbow on this one. So for handbow, and again, Kingdom of Ontario rules are that literally we straddle the shooting line. Scouts in this area have either up until recently, or it might still be this way, are taught to toe into the line, which means their front foot toe touches the shooting line, so their whole body is behind it. So a lot of times when we're teaching scouts, we have to remind them, no, 1 foot on each side of the shooting line. And again, that's something that may vary by kingdom. It may be that kingdom you're in actually does toe into the line, or puts the front foot firmly on the line or whatever. So knowing your local rules is a good thing. And most of that usually can be found in your kingdom's archery handbook. Okay, so we straddle the line. We generally keep our feet pointed down the line, parallel, about shoulder width apart. And we try not to lock the knees. We try just have a nice, comfortable, balanced stance. And again, this part you can't really see in the camera. So basically the first goal of this is you want everything basically from the hips down to always be the same so that you can focus on what you're doing up here. Because up here is where it's really easy to draw differently, to twist or do something, bend. And so if you get to the point where you're comfortable with that and do that every time, then you can focus more on the little details up here to work on being more consistent here. Okay, so feet shoulder length apart, knees not locked. Teach you a couple things on the bow first, some terminology. So string, this is called the knock bead. Putting the arrow onto the string is called knocking the arrow. In this case, there's an arrow rest. Not all bows have that. Some you shoot off your hand. This is part of the bow from one limb to the other. It's called the riser and the bow grip. And then these are the limbs. So just to kind of go over a little terminology so that it makes more sense if you hear those words. Also on the string, there's this center section here that has wrapped material around it. That's called serving. What that does is that makes it so when you're knocking the arrows and shooting them, it's wearing on that instead of the string itself, because it's a lot easier to replace that every so often than to replace the whole string every so often. Okay, so typically, when we get set, we square our shoulders to the target. So if you drew a line across your shoulders, you'd be pointed at the target. What that means is if you line up, like if someone else is directly in front of the target, you might actually turn your body slightly. Again, keeping your feet on both sides of the line so that you're pointed at the target. And you can do that in any direction. So if you're at an end of a shooting line or something, you make that adjustment so that the rest of your form is still true to what you're trying to hit downrange. The next step is drawing the bow, which there are multiple ways to do. And actually, even before that, let's get to finger placement on the string, which there are multiple ways to do. The most common ones around here are 2 fingers below the arrow. Let me grab an arrow because it'll be easier to really demonstrate. So if I have the arrow nocked, so the 2 fingers below, and again, if it snaps on like most of them do, or if it slides on and it kind of sits on the nock bead, you're generally not pinching the arrow, you're just grabbing the string above and below. The other method is 3 fingers below. Haven't seen any specific advantage or disadvantage to either method. I tend to use 2 below, 1 above. I know that one of the guys who went through training always teaches 3 below, but there's, in my experience, no difference. Again, another detail which can be a thing is nock bead. Know where the arrow nocks. If you'll notice, with this nocked here, it's fairly straight, but a lot of people set their bows up for nock under. So if you habitually nock under, you're now actually aiming higher with the arrow on one where the bead is set for nock over. So if it's not your bow, make sure you know which it's supposed to be before you shoot it. Okay, so if I do 1 above, 2 below, and then when I draw it, I want to find a spot that I can draw it to the same place every time. One mistake I made when I was starting out wasn't a huge thing. I was still shooting, I was still having fun, but I realized that as I gained more experience, it was contributing to my inconsistency, is I used my thumb for my placement. So if you think about it, you've got 3 fingers on the string, you've got your thumb for a placement. If I'm drawing back to here, I mean, like this hand can be anywhere. So it was kind of consistent, but not really. So what most people do is they will literally, as they draw back, they'll use usually like their top or their middle finger and have that touch somewhere, like the corner of their mouth, and use that as their anchor point. By bringing it to the same anchor point every time, it helps you be consistent with where the arrows are going down range. And if you watch the aiming video I did, having that consistency, that similar draw length every time is a huge help if you start doing aiming techniques. Because if you draw an extra inch, you can be adding 2-3 pounds of force to the arrow. If you draw an extra short an inch, you can be losing 2-3 pounds of force, which of course affects where it's going to hit. So you try and draw to the same spot every time. You want to be set. You don't want to just draw and let go. You want to draw, stop a moment. Some people may exhale or inhale and then stop the breath, and that's when they loose, because then they know that they're not moving. I've seen some people where, you know, inhaling, exhaling moves them enough that you can see the difference on the target. So having a spot where you can stop your breath, hold your breath for a moment to make sure you're set, loose the arrow is big. Now, drawing the string is one of two ways. So there's what they call a push-pull method, which often starts, you load it. This is called tabling the bow, where you can use the bow to help hold the arrow while you knock it on the string. So push-pull usually starts in this kind of position, and what you're doing is you're both pushing the bow out and pulling the string at the same time. That uses more of this shoulder and kind of this arm, and then the back muscles between the shoulders, if you're doing it right, to get locked in place. For me, I have a probable shoulder injury, so it uses more of the shoulder and starts to hurt. Another way I've seen people do it is they will literally set the bow on their target, and they will grab and they will just pull back, and then they will loose. So having the bow in a consistent spot here and then drawing back and shooting. Those are the two methods I'm aware of. I think I have heard one person who, because of the way their strength of their body was, would actually bring it up here, basically draw, then push the bow out. To me, that one takes the most arm strength, because you're literally using your arm only when you're pushing the bow out like that. So a few different ways to draw the bow. Whichever one works for you is the best one to use. Most of the people I know do the push-pull method, which again was drawing and pushing the bow out at the same time. Okay, so some other tips along with anchoring at the same point every time is your grip on the bow. When you're gripping the bow, you want it to be a fairly loose grip. It's normal for any new archer to want to really hold that bow tight. I did it. Pretty much everyone has done it when they've been new, because you don't want the bow to drop. But if you'll notice when I draw this, my fingers are actually out. So this is strictly my the crook of my thumb and finger and the palm of my hand holding the bow. Because what can happen if you put too much pressure here, you can push the bow down. You can push the bow to the side by, depending on the shape of the handle, and all of that changes your aim and where the arrow is going to go. So for consistency's sake, you want a loose grip. What I normally do, like what I would do with my Black Widow, is I got to a point where, as I recall, it has a higher grip, which forces your wrist to kind of do this. So I would do the bottom three fingers loosely on the bottom of the grip, and then these two not locked on or anything. So that keeps it from coming out of your hand, but it lets you keep a loose grip so that you are moving the bow inadvertently while you're shooting. The last thing I'm going to cover is when you release. It's very easy, especially if you've tried to hold the bow too long. If you're tired, you might notice that you're kind of letting the string forward and then releasing. That's a good sign that it's time to take a break, or that the bow might be a little bit too heavy for you. What you should be doing is literally relaxing the fingers and pulling them straight out away. You don't want to have them tight and pull them away. You end up doing what's referred to as plucking the string. And what that'll actually do is pull the string out away from you and then let go of it. So now you've changed the angle that the arrow's shooting. And so not consistent results if you do that. Couple things equipment-wise that I didn't mention, because I came out here with what I had set up and said, okay, I'll do this video. I usually use a bow glove, a 3-finger glove. You can also use finger tabs, which hook on your middle finger and then wrap around the string. And most finger tabs I've seen are designed literally for 1 over 2 under on the fingers because they have a slit in the middle for the arrow. The gloves cover 3 fingers. They leave your thumb and your pinky uncovered. On the bow hand, I always wear a bracer. Bracers are optional. Gloves are optional. Some people have calluses. They're like, whatever, I can shoot with a bare hand. That's fine. Some people want the glove. It's more comfortable. Sometimes the draw weight's just heavy enough that it can kind of start to hurt the middle fingers. You don't want to draw into the joint on your fingers because that will actually start to pinch nerves there. We actually have an archer who hasn't shot in about, I don't know, I think he said about a year now because he was doing, well, half a year because he started during COVID at the house just practicing doing draws every day just to keep in shape. And he was putting it in the crook of his finger to avoid dry firing, which I can explain in a moment. And 70 reps a day, and pretty soon he couldn't feel the tips of his fingers because of injuring the nerves here. So you want it out on the fingertips, and that's why a lot of people prefer the gloves because the gloves offer leather padding on your fingertips to handle the pressure of the bowstring. On the bow hand, if I'm shooting a period bow, I shoot with a bow glove, which literally covers the index finger and thumb, and it has an extra leather pad on top that the arrow sits on to shoot off of. I also wear a bracer, and again, some people don't. The idea is if your form is accurate and consistent, the string shouldn't be striking you in the forearm. And therefore, if you're doing that, you shouldn't need a bracer. However, if you discover you're not doing that, it's very painful. And so I just wear a bracer. And an interesting thing I've noted with the bracer is for recurves, they tend to hit either the elbow or up at the top of the arm. So I tend to wear the bracer back here. When I switch to longbow, they have usually a shorter brace height. Brace height is the distance between the arrow rest and the string. Longbows tend to have shorter one, which means the string tends to hit up further, so it'll hit more like in the wrist. So when I switch to longbow, I have to remember to move that bracer forward so that it provides the protection. Now, I mentioned dry firing. Didn't explain what that is earlier. Dry firing is drawing and loosing without an arrow on the bow. So much the way dry firing a gun is not likely to damage it one time, but is not good for it. Same with the bow. It's one time, it's not likely to cause an issue, but it can, depending on the age of the bow, it can very much lead to bow failure because you're taking all the energy of the string and vibrating it up and down those bow limbs until it works its way out. And so that can cause fractures or cause, if the glue in that's old, it can force it to start separating, and then, you know, several times of shooting it down the line, you end up with the bow delaminating or breaking. So I think I have covered the basics with shooting handbow. I will go ahead because I think we have enough time in this video. I don't think it's too long, and cover some basics with crossbow. So crossbow, we have the same expectations that you straddle the line, and crossbows can be strung usually one of two ways. So usually you either use the stirrup, which means you're hooking the stirrup on your foot and then bending over and pulling this up, which is the way I'll be doing it. Or, especially for those who also use it for combat archery, what you'll find is that they tend to put it against their hip. They might have a leather pad or something. They'll put it against their hip, grab the string, and cock it this way. So 2 ways of cocking it. Now, We are cautious when we see people doing the hip one. They usually stay pretty upright, so it's not usually an issue. But if you see them bending over to do it, they're bending and putting their head potentially in front of the next archer, so that becomes a safety concern. Which brings up one other thing I didn't cover under target or under handbows. It applies to either one, handbow and crossbow. If you drop your ammunition on the target side of the line, leave it. It's dead. If you bend over to grab it, someone will likely call a hold because, as I just mentioned, the risk of putting your head in front of someone else's full draw bow in the process of bending over to grab it. Okay, back to what I was talking about. So, with crossbow, if they do the stirrup cock method, which is the way I do it, one thing that I try to teach archers, crossbow shooters, if they're newer to it and I see them, is use the off-range foot to do this. We have a couple of older archers, or at least one, who he uses his front foot. It's the way he's always done it. He's not going to change. What he does is he will bring that foot to the line, do the cock, and then put the foot back out in front while he gets into his form to shoot. So way around the issue of leaning forward and possibly putting your head out there. But for new archers, new crossbow shooters, we try to encourage do it on the off-range foot because then it's not an issue. And if you get in that habit, then you don't have to worry about it. So when stringing a crossbow, one of the things that I've seen some people do is they'll actually put a little mark on the center of the string so they can make sure they're stringing it the same every time, because it is possible to pull more with one arm or the other. You end up with the string offset, and then when it looses, it kicks the bolt one way or another, so you don't get a straight shot. The other part of that is that a lot of times on the prods themselves, we'll put a mark where center is, because sometimes they work loose and they shift off center. And so having a quick reference to look at to say, oh, look, the prod has shifted is a lot nicer than pull out a tape measure in the middle of practice and measure from center of crossbow to each end to see if it's still in the middle or not. But I've done it that way too. It works just fine. Okay, so drawing, try and make sure it stays center. At this point, once you draw the string and you bring the crossbow up, load it. Now, one thing we encourage on tier, and this may vary by kingdom, is not loading like this. Because if that trigger gets hit somehow, this bolt, in this instance, since I'm in my yard, is probably about 3 streets down. Obviously, at an event, depending on where your archery range is, I mean, that could be of your event, that could be, it's going to land somewhere where they're not expecting archery to be happening. So we encourage keeping the bow as level as you can when you load it, or possibly even putting it down just a little. That way, if anything happens to bump the trigger, it's going to just go straight rather than up in the air. Okay, so then the other part, again, is different depending on your crossbow style. Some crossbows have like a little round thing here, and they're longer than this, and they're literally designed to be shot off your shoulder. If they're designed that way, you're going to be more facing the target. You're going to be setting that on your shoulder and leaning over, siding, and usually, if you're shooting this way, you have 2 or 3 fingers on top and you're pulling the trigger with your thumb. If you're doing it the way I'm doing it, you're bringing this into the shoulder. It kind of looks more like a rifle And for me, I put my thumb on top and I use 2 fingers on the trigger, and I find my aim point. I make sure I've got this locked in, as I discussed in the aiming video. This elbow against the body, the fingers and the thumb holding this to prevent rocking when I pull the trigger, and loose. Some people with crossbow prefer to do the slow draw, like like you might be familiar with rifle shooters, just slow, 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 and then it's just going to go. For me, I don't have the strength with the neck injury and that to do that. So for me, it's a quick release each time, which is part of the reason that is important, is to keep this from rocking when I pull the trigger quickly. Couple things to note. It's very easy for the fingers and thumbs to go from here to up here, and that becomes, let's see if I can show you this on the side. So that becomes very painful very quickly if you get your fingers or your thumb up where the string hits them. Done that multiple times. I regret it every time. It's a very painful thing. Trying to think, sorry, I didn't really write down or, exactly specifically plan out, discuss this and this. So I'm kind of doing this off my head and trying to make sure that I'm covering things. One thing we tend to encourage for crossbow shooters, especially if they have the metal prods, let me actually unstring this fast. Okay, is we usually put a little leather pad here, because you never know if the metal might have just a small ridge that you can't even really feel, but that will cut through the string. So we do a little leather pad on each end just to provide a little bit of a buffer between the string and the prod. Not going to make someone do it, but good habit to get into if you have leather pads available. I mean, you can cut them out of some scrap leather. They're about an inch by about half an inch, so pretty small. And it can help preserve the life of your string a bit. Other than that, you start getting in with crossbow, start getting into some maintenance stuff. So things that can help your shots be more consistent or cause them to be less consistent is if the roller nut is able to move like side to side, if it doesn't fit on the axle very well, or it's worn maybe, again, that'll affect the way the string releases. In this case, I've actually put some grease into, because I have brass on steel, so I put a little grease in to let it spin more freely. I also will go in fairly regularly and put a little grease on the end of the trigger, because the trigger, which is metal, is going against, in this case, a brass roller nut, but even the nylon ones, I forget the exact name of the plastic, have a metal plate usually that the trigger's hitting against. So I'll grease that, because that'll allow the trigger to let loose more consistently. If you don't have that, what I've noticed is at times it'll kind of get stuck and then it'll let go. And by the time it does, you've already expected the shot. And so you may start moving that, and then it's like, oh, there it goes. And yeah, just wasted a shot. So those are more maintenance things, but just as you shoot, some things you might be aware of if you start seeing any kind of weirdnesses with your shooting. Another is that if your prod is pulling unevenly, I actually have one in the house that one side pulls more than the other, and so it was consistently shooting off to one side. Things like that can impact your accuracy. I think that pretty much covers the basics of shooting crossbow, the basics of shooting handbow, of our stance, of some of the safety rules on our SCA ranges. Again, what I'm covering is what I know in on tier as safety rules. Verify what your kingdom's safety rules are so that you follow them. The last thing I would want someone to do is think that what I covered applies somewhere else and find out it doesn't, and they get, in trouble somehow for not towing into the line instead of straddling it, or something like that. Hope this helps any new archers who are trying to get started. Have a good day. Thank you.